The hand reached for the letter, and the dog took it back with his teeth. Not the letter. The hand. Or near enough. Close enough that the orderly felt the air move where the jaws snapped shut a half-inch from his knuckles, felt the heat of breath and the wet snarl of something that had decided, on this one small patch of stripped mattress, that the rules of the United States Army no longer applied. He jerked back. Swore. Cradled the hand against his chest the way you do when you've been close enough to losing fingers to feel how it would have gone. And the dog did not move. That's the thing the men in that barracks would remember later, the detail that stuck, not the snarl. Snarls are cheap, every junkyard mutt has a snarl. What they remembered was the stillness on either side of it. The dog stood over a bare bunk in the gray light of a Tuesday morning, one front paw planted square on a single cream-colored envelope, and between the moments he had to bare his teeth he was utterly, terribly calm. Not frantic. Not afraid. A sentry who knew his post and would hold it until relieved, and who had not yet, in 4 days, been relieved. 4 days. I want you to sit with that number, because we're going to come back to it, and by the time we do it's going to mean something very different than it means to you right now. 4 days. That's how long a Dutch shepherd named Ash had stood guard over an empty bed and a sealed letter, refusing food past what kept him standing, refusing to let any hand in that building touch the one thing on the mattress. And the men who outranked him, the men with the keys and the clipboards and the authority of the whole institution behind them, could not make him stop. Let me tell you what the institution had already decided, because it had decided fast. The bunk belonged to a junior intelligence officer. 3 days before the morning that hand got snapped at, she had failed to return from an assignment off post. Routine, the paperwork said. A liaison run. The kind of thing that gets logged and forgotten. She didn't come back. And the command did the math the way commands do when the answer is convenient, in an afternoon. No body. No transmission. A junior officer who'd been, the file would gently note, under some stress lately, who'd been asking questions outside her lane, who'd had, it would be implied without ever quite being said, reasons of her own to disappear. AWOL. Absent without leave. The cleanest word in the military dictionary, because it puts the weight on the one who's gone. She left. We didn't lose her, she abandoned us. Close the file. Crate the dog. Reassign the bunk by end of week. That's how it was written. And I've read a lot of files in my time. I've read the kind that get written from the conclusion backward, where you can feel the author working out the answer first and reverse engineering the questions to fit it. This was one of those. You learn to smell it. The speed is the tell. Real grief is slow and real investigation is slower, and anything that moves at the speed of convenient was never about finding out what happened. It was about deciding what happened, and making the deciding stick. The only problem with the file, the only loose thread in an otherwise tidy garment, was the dog who would not stop guarding her bed. His name was Ash. A Dutch shepherd, brindle-dark, lean the way the good ones are lean, all cable and intention. Not a patrol dog, not a bite work specialist. He'd been trained for detection, explosives, the careful chemistry of finding the thing that's meant to stay hidden. A working dog, paired to the missing officer for the better part of 2 years. They'd deployed together. They'd come home together. He slept at the foot of her bunk every night the regs would allow and a few they wouldn't, and nobody made much of it because everybody knew better than to get between that handler and that dog. Now the handler was a closed file and the dog was a problem. It's just an animal, one of the sergeants said, that first day, when Ash wouldn't be leashed off the bunk. He said it the way people say it, not cruel, just certain, the way you state a fact so obvious it ends the conversation. It's just an animal whining at an empty bed. Give him a day, he'll forget. They always forget. And here's where I have to stop you because that sentence, it's just an animal, is the whole hinge of everything that's coming, and I don't want you to skate past it the way that barracks skated past it. That sergeant was wrong. But he wasn't wrong because he didn't love dogs. He probably loved dogs fine. He was wrong because of a thing humans do almost without noticing. We decide in advance what a creature is capable of, and then we only see the evidence that fits. It's just an animal means it cannot know anything I don't know. It cannot understand anything that matters. Its behavior is noise and my interpretation is signal. And so every single thing that dog did over the next 4 days, and he was doing something very specific, very deliberate, with a clarity that should have stopped that whole building cold, got filed under grief. Under whining. Under the animal hasn't accepted it yet. Nobody asked the only question that mattered. Nobody stood in that barracks and looked at a detection dog guarding one specific object on an otherwise empty bed and asked, What does he know that we decided not to? Because to ask that question, you'd have to entertain the possibility that the closed file was wrong. And a great many people had a great deal invested in that file staying closed. So let me tell you what was actually happening on that bunk, in the language of the only witness who was telling the truth. When the officer didn't come back, the barracks did the human thing. They came to clear the space. Strip the bed, bag the effects, ready the bunk for the next body the army would put in it. An orderly came with a duffel and a clipboard. Ash let him strip everything. The sheets, the blanket, the small accumulated nothings of a life lived out of a footlocker. The dog watched it go and did not lift his head. But there was one thing on that mattress the officer had left behind, set deliberately on the pillow before she walked out the door 3 days earlier, a single sealed envelope, cream-colored, a name written on the front in her own hand. And when the orderly reached for that, Ash came up off the floor like something released from a trap and put himself between the hand and the letter, and the barracks learned, in about a second and a half, exactly where the line was. They tried again the next day. MPs, this time. 2 of them, because somebody had decided the dog needed handling. Ash held the line. He didn't attack. Understand that, it's important. He never once crossed into actually biting a man. He only ever made it unmistakable that he could. He'd been trained to a control most humans never achieve. He held the threat at exactly the pressure required and not a gram more. A detection dog. A precision instrument. Holding a letter on a pillow against the entire weight of the building, with nothing but the certainty that this was his job now, that she had left him on this post, and that he had not been relieved. By the 3rd day the story had started to travel, the way stories do, that dog in the intel barracks, the one that won't let go of the dead girl's letter. People came to look. Somebody filmed it on a phone. And still the prevailing wisdom held, grief. Sud. Somebody should really crate that animal before it hurts a soldier. And on the 4th day, the general's people came. They didn't say they were the general's people. They never do. They came as a small efficient delegation with the right paperwork and the calm authority of men acting on behalf of someone whose name opens doors, and they said they were there to recover sensitive materials that the missing officer may have improperly retained. They had a folder. They had a phrase for everything. They had, specifically, an interest in any documents or correspondence the officer might have left behind. Any correspondence. Such as, for instance, a sealed letter sitting on a pillow. And I want you to notice the shape of this, because it's the kind of thing that tells you everything if you're paying attention. A junior officer goes AWOL, runs off, abandons her post. A nothing case, close the file. And yet within 4 days a delegation arrives, sent quietly from very high up, specifically to make sure nothing she left behind ends up in the wrong hands. You don't send men like that to clean up after a deserter. You send men like that to clean up after a witness. The senior man in the delegation crouched down a careful distance from the bunk and looked at the dog, and the dog looked back at him, and something passed between them that was older than either of their uniforms. The man understood, I think, in that crouch, that the simple version was not going to work. That this was not an animal whining at an empty bed. That this was a guard, and guards can be removed but they cannot be talked out of a post, and that whatever was in that envelope, the dog had assigned it a value the man's whole careful operation had failed to account for. Sedate it if you have to, he said, standing, brushing off his knees. But that letter comes with us today. Quietly. He said quietly the way Walsh's people always said things. As if quiet were a kind of authority all its own. That was the morning. That was the 4th day. The vet was on his way with a syringe, the delegation was waiting with its folder, and a Dutch shepherd stood over the last thing a dead woman ever wrote, holding a line that the entire United States Army had decided was just an animal being sad. And then the door at the end of the barracks opened, and a different kind of soldier walked in. The soldier who walked through that door was not young, and was not in a hurry, and did not reach for anything. That was the first difference, and the dog clocked it before any of the humans did. Every other person who'd come at that bunk in 4 days had come with their hands already moving, reaching, leashing, gesturing, the body language of people who'd already decided how this ended and were just executing it. This man came in with his hands empty and his hands still, and he stopped a good 10 feet short of the bunk, and he did the thing none of them had thought to do. He waited. His name was Hollis. A warrant officer, Army CID, the criminal investigators, the ones who work the cases the chain of command would often rather not have worked. He'd been Quinn's instructor years back, when she was coming up, and then something more like a mentor, and then the closest thing to a father that a service career leaves room for. He'd taught her how to read a file from the conclusion backward. He'd taught her that the speed is the tell. He'd gotten the call about her 2 days late and from 3 commands over, because somebody had been careful about who got told what, and he had driven through the night to stand in this barracks and find out why a closed case had a delegation attached to it. And now he stood 10 feet from a snarling detection dog, and he did not see an animal being sad. He saw a witness who couldn't speak refusing to surrender the evidence. "Easy," Hollis said. Not to calm the dog. You don't calm a dog like that with a word, and he knew it. He said it the way you announce yourself to a sentry. "I see your post. I see what you're holding. I'm not going to insult you by pretending you're confused." Then he crouched slow, all the way down to the dog's level, and he stayed there, and he started to talk. Low. Even. Not commands. Just talk, the cadence of a man who has sat with frightened things before and knows that what they need is not to be overpowered but to be relieved. "I know her. I know whose letter that is. You held it. You held it 4 days, and that's longer than anyone in this building, and I'm here now, and I think you've been waiting for somebody who'd actually take it where it needs to go instead of making it disappear." The dog's ears moved. That was the first crack, not in the dog's resolve, but in something closer to recognition. Maybe it was the cadence. Maybe Hollis carried some ghost of Quinn's own scent from years of working alongside her, some signature in the chemistry the rest of us can't read but a detection dog lives inside of. Maybe, and I lean toward this one, though I can't prove it and neither can you, maybe the dog had simply been waiting. All 4 of those days, not for the threat to stop, but for the right person to start. Holding a post isn't refusing to give the thing up. Holding a post is keeping the thing safe until the one who's supposed to have it arrives. Hollis held out his hand. Open. Flat. Not toward the letter. Toward the dog. And the Dutch shepherd, who had snarled the institution back from that pillow for 96 hours, lowered his head, and stood off the envelope, and stepped back. The barracks went dead silent. Because they had all watched, for 4 days, men with every kind of authority fail to move that dog 1 inch. And now they watched him simply step aside for a man who'd asked him nothing, ordered him nothing, only knelt down and spoke to him like the soldier he was. The delegation's senior man started forward, and Hollis stopped him with a look that had a great deal of CID in it. "That's evidence in an open investigation," Hollis said. "The case is closed. It's open as of about 40 seconds ago." He didn't raise his voice. "I'm Zayda. That letter is material to a death I'm now investigating, and the next hand that touches it that isn't gloved and mine is going to be obstructing a federal inquiry. You want to make that call on the general's behalf? Get him on the phone. Let's all hear him tell me to walk away from a dead officer's last words." Nobody got anybody on the phone. That's the other tell, by the way, the one that came years of doing this to recognize. Innocent men make the call. Innocent men say get the general, he'll sort this out, because innocent men believe the truth is on their side and the phone is their friend. Guilty operations go quiet. The delegation looked at each other, and they did the math the same way the command had done it 4 days earlier, fast and for convenience, and the math now said leave. So they left. Folder and all. And I want you to hold on to the fact that a sealed envelope on a pillow had, for 4 days, been the most dangerous object on that entire post, dangerous enough to send men from very high up to retrieve it quietly, and the only reason it was still there to be dangerous was a dog who wouldn't let go. Hollis pulled on a glove. He picked up the envelope. And he read the name written on the front, in Quinn's own steady hand. It wasn't his name. It was a 4-star name. Let me tell you who Quinn was, because she's earned it, and because the file that called her a deserter was never going to. Lieutenant Mara Quinn. 29 years old. Army intelligence, and good at it, good in the specific way that makes a junior officer beloved by exactly the wrong people and trusted by exactly the right ones. She was an analyst by trade, the kind who lived in the logistics, in the supply runs and the convoy routes and the boring arterial plumbing of how a deployed force keeps itself fed and armed. Unglamorous work. The work nobody films. The work where, if you're paying attention, and Quinn paid attention the way Hollis had taught her to, you can sometimes see a shape moving under the surface that nobody's supposed to see. What she'd seen was a pattern in the routing. Convoys and liaison runs that kept getting assigned through corridors they had no good reason to use. Corridors that were a little more exposed, a little less covered, a little more known, it would turn out, to the people on the other side who profited from knowing. She'd seen good men routed into bad ground often enough that it stopped looking like luck. She'd started pulling the thread. Quietly. The way you do when you don't yet know how high the thing goes and you're smart enough to be afraid of the answer. And then she'd started asking questions outside her lane. That phrase in the file, asking questions outside her lane, that was the institution's polite way of saying she noticed. That she'd gone to people above her with a pattern and a worry, and that somewhere in that chain her worry had reached a desk it should never have reached. A desk belonging to the man whose name was on the routing orders, the man who'd been quietly selling the location and timing of those runs to the people who turned them into ambushes. 4 years, for money, the man with 4 stars on his shoulder. General Walsh. She figured out it was him. And she was smart enough, God she was smart, to know what that meant for a 29-year-old lieutenant who'd noticed something a 4-star needed unnoticed. She knew the math. She knew that the moment she could prove it, she became the loose thread, and loose threads on operations like that one don't get reassigned. They get closed. So before she walked out the door on that last liaison run, the one routed, you'll have guessed by now, through exactly the kind of corridor she'd been warning everyone about, she did the only thing she could think of to make sure the truth outlived her. She wrote it all down. The pattern. The routing orders. The dates. The proof. She put it in an envelope. She wrote his name on the front, because she wanted whoever opened it to understand instantly that this was not grief or paranoia, this was an accusation with a target. And she set it on her pillow, in the one place in the entire world she knew would be guarded by something that could not be bribed, could not be ordered, could not be made to do the convenient thing. She left it with her dog. Hollis stood in that silent barracks and read it through twice, and the men who'd been calling it whining watched his face change as he read, and what they saw there was not surprise. It was the particular grief of a man finding out that the thing he'd feared was true, and that the person he'd feared it for had already paid for it. Because here's what the letter made plain, in Quinn's own clear hand. She'd known. That was the part that broke him, I think, not the treason. Treason is just a fact, you process it and you act on it. What broke Hollis was the calm of the document. She hadn't written it in panic. She'd written it the way he taught her to write a finding, cold, ordered, complete. A woman setting down the proof of her own murder in advance, in a steady hand, because she'd done the math on her own life and arrived at the answer and decided the only thing left in her power was to make sure the answer didn't die with her. If you're reading this, the letter began, and I'll spare you most of it, because some of it belonged to Hollis and to her mother and to no one else. If you're reading this, then I didn't come back, and I need you to understand that I didn't run. I didn't run. I want that on the record before anything else. Whatever the file says, I didn't run. And then the proof. Cold and complete. The general's name, and the routing, and the dates, and the way it all locked together into a thing no convenient file could survive contact with. She'd ended it the way she'd have ended a briefing. No flerist. Just the truth, and then the door. But there was one line at the bottom, under the proof, after the cold part was done, in slightly smaller writing, like she'd added it last and meant it most. Hollis read that line and had to stop for a moment, there in front of all of them, and put his gloved hand flat on the stripped mattress where the dog had stood his post. Whoever finds this, she'd written, he'll have stayed. He won't have understood why, but he'll have stayed, because I asked him to guard the bunk one last time and he's never once let me down. Take care of Ash. He kept faith when I couldn't be here to keep it for him. He's the best soldier I ever served with. And the Dutch shepherd, relieved of his post at last, walked the few feet to where Hollis knelt, and lay down against the mattress that no longer held anything to guard, and let out a breath that 4 days had been holding in. It took Hollis 11 days to get the letter in front of the right people, and every one of those 11 days was a fight, because a 4-star name doesn't sit in a sealed envelope without that envelope generating a great deal of weather. There were calls. There were suggestions that the matter was delicate. There were officers, decent ones, who took Hollis aside and told him, not unkindly, that he was about to spend the rest of his career on the wrong end of a man who could end careers with a phone call, and was a dead lieutenant's letter really worth that? There were quieter conversations too, the kind that come without names attached, the kind that mention how regrettable it would be if the integrity of the evidence came into question. If, for instance, it came out that the document had been in the unsecured possession of an animal for 4 days before any investigator laid hands on it. Chain of custody, they said. A defense attorney would have a field day. Who's to say what a dog did with it? And I want you to notice the shape of that, because it's the oldest move there is. When they can't beat the truth, they go after the witness. And the witness, in this case, was a dog, and you can't impeach a dog, so they tried to impeach the 4 days he'd spent keeping the thing safe. They tried to turn his loyalty into a flaw in the evidence. It didn't work. It didn't work because the letter was in Quinn's own hand, and the proof inside it pointed at records that existed independently of the letter. The routing orders were real, the dates were real, and once an honest investigator knew where to look, the pattern Quinn had died seeing was sitting right there in the system for anyone with the will to see it. The letter wasn't the case. The letter was the map. And no amount of who's to say what a dog did with it changes what the map points to once you've walked the ground yourself. So 11 days later, General Walsh sat at a polished table in a quiet room, with his lawyer beside him and 4 stars still on his shoulder, and watched Hollis lay a cream-colored envelope down on the wood between them. Walsh was good. I'll give him that, because pretending he wasn't would be lying to you, and the whole point of this is that I don't lie to you. He was good in the way the dangerous ones are good, calm, gracious, faintly puzzled, a senior officer generously making time for a misunderstanding he was confident he could clear up. He'd buried men under his command with full honors. He'd stood at the gravesides. He'd been, by every account, a soldier's general, the kind who remembered names and wrote the letters home himself. And every bit of that was real, which is exactly what made it work. The performance wasn't separate from the man. The performance was the man, polished over so many years that he'd likely stopped being able to find the seam himself. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the name on the front, his own name in a dead woman's hand, and something moved behind his eyes, fast, and then was put away. "Lieutenant Quinn," he said, gently. "A tragedy. A troubled young officer. I understand she'd been struggling." He let that sit, the way a man lets a generous thing sit. "Whatever she wrote, and I haven't read it, I won't pretend to know what's in a grieving woman's letter. I'd ask you to consider the source, warrant officer. And the circumstances. And the fact that this document, by your own report, sat unsecured for the better part of a week." "It didn't sit unsecured," Hollis said. "No. It was guarded." Walsh almost smiled. "By a dog. By her dog. 4 days. Wouldn't let an MP near it. Wouldn't let your people near it." Hollis let that one land, your people, and watched it land, watched the smallest tightening at the corner of Walsh's mouth, the only crack the man would give him. "You sent men to make this letter quietly disappear, General. They came back without it. You want to know why?" "I sent no one." "You want to know why they came back without it," Hollis went on, like the denial was whether he was waiting out. "It's because a detection dog with no rank and no orders stood on that pillow and decided your authority stopped at the edge of that mattress. And he was right. He held that line 4 days. So before you tell me again about a troubled young officer and an unsecured document," he tapped the envelope once, "understand what you're actually arguing. You're arguing that a dog can't be trusted to guard the truth. And General, that dog kept faith with her for 4 days straight." He leaned in, and his voice didn't rise, it dropped, the way it does when a thing is finally and completely true. "That's longer than you did. You had years." The room was very quiet. Walsh's lawyer started to say something about adjourning, about counsel, about the irregularity of the proceedings, and Walsh raised one hand a half-inch off the table to silence him. An old reflex, the reflex of command, the body still issuing orders the situation had already revoked. He looked at the envelope. And he asked the only question left in him, and he asked it almost wonderingly, the way a man asks about a thing he genuinely cannot fit inside his understanding of the world. "You're telling me," he said, "that a dog kept this evidence intact for 4 days." "No, sir," Hollis said. "I'm telling you he kept faith for 4 days. The evidence staying intact was just what that looked like from the outside. And that small correction, faith, not evidence, was the moment it ended, though it would take the lawyers months to make the ending official. Because Walsh understood, finally, what he was up against, and it wasn't a letter, and it wasn't a warrant officer, and it wasn't even the record sitting in the system waiting to be walked. It was a thing he'd spent a whole career learning to count on never showing up, something that could not be reasoned with, bought, ordered, or outlasted. He built his entire operation on the safe assumption that everyone has a price and everyone eventually does the convenient thing. He'd been undone by the one soldier on that post who'd never heard of convenient. They took his name off the door within the year. The court-martial was real and the sentence was real, and the families of the men he'd sold, 11 of them, across 4 years, 11 sets of routing orders that became 11 ambushes, got, at the long last, the one thing the official record had stolen from them, the truth about how their people died. Not in bad luck. Not in the ordinary arithmetic of war. In betrayal, with a name attached, and the name was finally said out loud in a room with stenographers in it. Mara Quinn did not run. The army said so, in the end. In writing. The file that called her a deserter was pulled and burned and replaced with one that called her what she was, an intelligence officer who'd uncovered treason at the highest level and been murdered for it, who'd had the foresight and the cold, clear courage to set the proof down in writing and leave it where it could not be taken. They restored her rank. They promoted her, posthumously, the way they do when they're trying to give back a piece of what they took. They put her name on the record of the honored instead of the record of the gone. She never got to see it. That's the part that doesn't have a happy ending, and I won't pretend it does. She'd done the math on her own life and gotten it right, and being right cost her everything, and no posthumous promotion brings a 29-year-old back to a world she loved enough to die telling the truth about. But somewhere, her name is clean. And it's clean because she refused to let the truth be buried, and because the one she trusted to guard it was the one creature on God's earth who didn't know how to do the convenient thing. Ash went home to her mother. That was the last line of Quinn's letter, the part that was only ever meant for Hollis. Take care of Ash, and Hollis took it as the order it was. He drove the dog himself, 2 states over, to a small house with a porch, and he put the leash in the hands of a woman who just had her daughter given back to her as a hero 11 days too late to hold her, and he told her what the dog had done. She kept him the rest of his days. They tell me he was an easy dog in the end, calm, watchful, good with the grandkids who came on Sundays, the kind of old shepherd who lies in a patch of sun and lifts his head when a car comes up the drive and decides, every time, that it's all right. He'd done his great work. He was allowed to rest. But here's the thing her mother noticed, the thing she told Hollis the one time he came back to check on the both of them, years later. Every night, the dog slept against the front door. Not in the warm kitchen, not on the good rug by the fire she'd set down special for him. Against the door. Facing it. The way you lie when you're keeping a post. And every morning he'd be there, head up, watching the road, the way you watch when you're waiting for someone to come up the drive. She framed the letter. She hung it in the front hall where you'd see it coming in. Quinn's own steady hand, behind glass, the proof in the door and the line at the bottom about the best soldier she ever served with. And beside it she hung the one photograph somebody had thought to take, in those 4 gray days in the barracks, before anyone understood what they were looking at. A dog on an empty bunk. One paw on a cream-colored envelope. Ears up. Eyes on the door. Underneath it, she wrote 2 words. He waited. Some things wait. Some things remember. Some things carry the truth across days and miles and the whole weight of an institution that would rather they didn't, and they carry it not because they understand it, but because someone they loved asked them to hold the line one last time, and they have never, not once, let that someone down. Mara Quinn couldn't deliver the truth herself. So she left it with the only soldier she knew couldn't be made to do the convenient thing. And he held it. 4 days. Until the right man came through the door. That's not a story about a dog. That's a story about what loyalty looks like when it has no reason left to keep going, and keeps going anyway. One last thing, before you go. I've spent a long time around stories that get closed too fast. Files written from the conclusion backward, the speed of convenience standing in for the slowness of the truth. And I've learned to watch the thing everyone else writes off. The detail that doesn't fit the tidy version. The witness nobody thinks to question because they've already decided it can't know anything that matters. It's just an animal. That's what they said, standing in front of the one creature in that whole building who was telling the truth. And they said it not because they were cruel, but because it's easier, it's so much easier, to decide in advance what something is capable of, and then only see the evidence that fits. Mara Quinn was 29. She never got to see her name made clean. But she knew when she set that letter down, exactly what she was leaving it with. Not an animal whining at an empty bed, but the best soldier she ever served with, who would stand a post she could no longer stand, and hold a line she could no longer hold, and keep faith long after the keeping cost him everything and explained itself to no one. He waited. And because he waited, the truth came up the drive. If there's something in your life standing watch over you that you've been calling just a dog, just a friend, just the quiet one who never makes a fuss, I'd take a long look at it before the world teaches you what it was worth. I'll see you in the next one.